The National Party had only a very small majority when it was first elected and no clear plan. But nevertheless, within the party, but only a very small majority. So, as we saw in the first lecture, the National Party had only a very small majority when it was first elected and no clear plan. But nevertheless, within days of the election, people began putting up whites-only signs in shops and putting partitions up on counters so that they had a white side to the counter and a black side to the counter. The apartheid government also began giving government work to Afrikaner industries and using Afrikaner banks, and it also appointed Afrikaners to key posts in central administrations, in education, the police force, etc., so that when it was ready to start passing laws, these could be put into place efficiently. At the heart of the Afrikaner policy, there were three main ideas. First of all, that different racial groups existed and each had its own culture. Secondly, that whites, as the civilized race, were entitled to have absolute control over the state. And third, and this is what would prove to be most important, the idea that the state would provide equal facilities for subordinate races. But the facilities would be tailored to each race's needs. So although they would all have the same sorts of facilities, so they would all have buses, for instance, they would all have schools, they didn't have to have as many buses, they didn't have to have the same number of pupils in each class, they didn't need to be taught the same sorts of things. So same facilities, but adapted to what people actually need. And of course they always estimated that the whites needed better facilities than the Africans. So a year after the elections, the Milan government passed the first act to the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act. Despite its name, this act only prohibited marriages between whites and non-whites. Marriages between different sorts of non-whites were still allowed. And this was a largely symbolic act, as there were very few marriages of this type, but it gave the impression that the government was protecting white supremacy, and by this act would stop any increase in the coloured population. A year later, in 1950, all the key acts for an effective apartheid policy would be passed, but the first of these, the Immorality Act, was also a largely symbolic act. This prohibited sexual relationships between white people and all non-white people. The previous Immorality Act, which dated back to 1927, only prohibited sexual relationships between whites and Africans. Sexual relationships between whites and coloureds and whites and Indians had been possible. And breaking this law was now punishable by up to 7 years in prison. Prison sentences, although did differ a little bit depending on the sex and the race of the offender. So in a relationship between a black man and a white woman, the black man would always be given the maximum prison sentence, while white women often found themselves not in prison but in a mental hospital because they'd been declared insane. And white men were sometimes acquitted, with their defense lawyer arguing that they had been seduced by the African woman. Far less symbolic, and the act which lay at the heart of the apartheid policy, was the Population Registration Act. This act classed everyone according to their race. When a child was born, its race was indicated on its birth certificate, and all adults had to have identity cards on which their race was indicated. And this very symbolic photo at the time shows you 4 boys with the 4 races going up to the white boy at the top. So Africans at the bottom, then Indians, who were considered slightly better, then coloureds, and finally the white boy on the top step. The problem was, how did you define the different races? And the law was not particularly clear about this. It said a white person is one who is in appearance obviously white and is not obviously non-white, or one who is generally accepted as white. So if you look white and other people think you're white, then you are white. A Bantu, and Bantu was the name that the government used to designate African people or black people, was a person who is or is generally accepted as a member of any Aboriginal race or tribe of Africa, while a coloured is a person who is not a white person or a Bantu. When officials couldn't quite decide how to classify someone, they were given various points that they were told to consider. So, for instance, the characteristics of the person's head hair, the characteristics of the person's other hair, their skin colour, their facial features, the size of their lips and the shape of their nose, their home language. If they spoke Afrikaans, they were probably white. If they spoke Xhosa, they were probably African. The area where the person lived, their friends and their acquaintances. If most of their friends were white, they lived in a white area, they were probably white. The type of job they had, the more qualified they were, the more likely they were to be white. So the same thing for the socioeconomic status. And their eating and drinking habits, whether their favourite food was a typical white food or a typical African food. Crude tests were used to determine race. The half moon on your fingernails would prove that you were white. In schools, they would put a pencil in a child's hair. If the pencil fell out, they were white. If the pencil stayed stuck in their hair, they were coloured or black. Because it was hard to tell with some people, people could appeal their classifications, and every year there was a report saying how many people had changed. So in 1981, just to give you one example, 558 coloureds became white, 15 whites became coloured, 79 blacks became coloured, 8 coloureds became black, but no black person became a white. Initially, the Act provided for 3 groups: white, coloured and native. But coloured was later redefined to differentiate between Cape Malay, Griqua, who were the Khoisan people, Indian, Chinese and Cape coloured. And you can see that in fact it was a political gesture rather than actual skin colour, because the Japanese, with whom South Africa had a lot of trade relationships, were considered as honorary whites. So if they came to South Africa, they were allowed to stay in white-only hotels, whereas when Chinese people came, they had to stay in coloured hotels. Another key law passed in 1950 was the Group Areas Act. This created different residential areas for different races. And it led to the forced removals of people who were living in the wrong areas. During the 1960s, 1970s and early 1980s, the government implemented a policy of resettlement to force people to move to their designated group areas. As one of the oldest black settlements in Johannesburg, Sophiatown held an almost symbolic importance for the 50,000 Africans who lived there. And despite vigorous protests and worldwide publicity, the removal of Sophiatown began on the 9th of February 1955 under the Western Areas Removal Scheme. And a similar thing happened in 1968 with the coloured people who lived at District 6 in Cape Town. So in 1955, the Africans from Sophiatown were transferred to a new place outside Johannesburg called Meadowlands, which would later become Soweto. The Sophiatown slum was destroyed by bulldozers, and a new white suburb named, ironically, Triumph was built in its place. So it's estimated that around 600,000 Indians and coloureds and Africans were forced to move to make way for entirely white suburbs. At the same time, in rural areas, around 40,000 white people were forced to move when black homelands were created. But there were also small-scale disruptions as well. Couples, so legally married couples, say between a white person and an Indian, were now forced to live in separate places because the white person in the couple had to live in a white area, the Indian person had to live in an Indian area. And so these couples, if they wanted to stay married, either they could just ignore the law, but very often they were denounced by their neighbours and arrested, or they could appeal against their classification and hope that they could both be classed as the same race, or some of the more wealthy ones chose to go into exile. Another important act in 1950 was the Suppression of Communism Act. This, as its name suggests, banned the South African Communist Party, but, and this is important, it also banned any other political party that the government chose to label as communist. So a student group, for example, that met to play music in a bar could be branded a communist party and the government could ban it. Disorderly gatherings were banned, and again the definition of disorderly gathering was very vague. It required a minimum of 3 people. That was a gathering, just 3 people, and if the government didn't like you, it could just have you arrested. So people belonging to an organisation which was banned could be listed. So that meant if they applied for a passport, for instance, it was quite often refused, and various other administrative privileges were problematic. Or more seriously, they could be given a banning order. So a banning order meant that the person was not allowed to meet with more than one person at a time other than the family. So they could only have one visitor at home. They couldn't hold any office in any organisation. They couldn't speak publicly or write for any publication. And they couldn't go to certain areas, buildings and institutions such as law courts, schools and newspaper offices. So they were allowed to go to work as long as they didn't work in one of these areas. This meant, for example, if you were a teacher or a journalist, you lost your job. If you were a student, you were no longer allowed to go to university. It's estimated that between 1950 and 1990, more than 2,000 people were banned in South Africa. The most extreme form of banning was a house arrest, where the person was confined to their own home. They weren't allowed to leave their home at all. And in both banning orders and house arrest, a policeman would be stationed outside the house to make sure the law was being obeyed. In 1951, the Bantus Authorities Act created homelands for the black people. These homelands, which you can see on this map, consisted of small bits of land. Each colour represents a particular homeland. And as you can see, they're separated. They don't even touch each other. And each of these lands would be administered by a Bantu authority, usually a white chief, under white supervision. Each homeland was a nation which would develop in its own way, and what the government wanted was that eventually all these homelands would become independent countries and have their own government, so that South Africans, the Africans, would vote in these homelands and not in South Africa as a whole. In 1952, the Native Laws Amendment Act narrowed the definition of the category of blacks who had the right of permanent residence in town. To be able to remain in a town, they had to have been born there and lived there continuously, so in the same town, for not less than 15 years. Or they had to have been employed in the same town continuously for at least 15 years, or had worked for the same employer for at least 10 years. And so obviously this enabled employers to blackmail their employees, telling them that if they left the job, then they would no longer be able to reside in the towns. And the ones who lost their residency in the towns had to return to a homeland, which for many of them was a place they had never even visited before. The same year, the ironically named Abolition of Passes and Coordination of Documents Act, or the Pass Laws, forced black people to carry identification with them at all times. It became a criminal offence to be unable to produce a pass when required to do so by the police. No black person could leave a rural area for an urban one without a permit from the local authorities. And on arrival in a urban area, a permit to work had to be sought within 72 hours. In 1953, the Bantu Education Act set up a new curriculum that was designed to be suited to the nature and requirements of the black people. In other words, that would give them only a very basic education. if they were never going to be allowed in a managerial role, there was no point in teaching them anything very advanced. And to stop them getting any ideas about rebellion or anything else, they were deliberately not taught subjects like history or philosophy. And the man who was behind the Education Act, the education minister at the time, was Hendrik Verwoerd, and he was later to become one of the most repressive prime ministers. And so this photo just gives you an idea of the sort of conditions in black schools. As you can see, these students don't even have a table, there's not enough chairs, they're squashed up on benches, they've got no books. So an appallingly poor level of education. A year later, in 1953, they passed the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act. And this forced segregation in all public amenities, public buildings and public transport, with the aim of eliminating all contact between whites and other races. Europeans only and non-Europeans only signs were put up. And this act specifically stated that the facilities provided for different races need not be equal. So in 1954, Milan, now aged 80, and satisfied that the policies he'd been put in place could not easily be overturned, retired. He was replaced by Johannes Gerhardus Strijdom, a hardline Afrikaner nationalist seen by many as more extreme than Milan. He removed the few remaining coloured voters from the electoral roll, but did little else of significance before he died in office in 1958. And he was replaced by Hendrik Verwoerd, who we just saw on the previous slide, who remained in office until 1966, when he was assassinated in the Parliament building in Cape Town. And until the very end of apartheid, they kept the stained piece of carpet on the floor with his blood stain on it as a sort of homage to him. And so I'd like to end the first part of the second lecture here, and we will then move on in the second lecture to looking at what Verwoerd did when he was Prime Minister.